Good evening. Well, this is our first Wednesday of the quarter, so we're not technically beginning a new study, but as I mentioned at the end of last quarter, we didn't get even close to done with our Proverbs study, but we began that last quarter, and I'll show you, let's see, that's kind of one of the key verses of Proverbs, I suppose. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. This is what I was looking for. We covered last quarter the first half, I don't know if it's actually half, the first half of the subcategories. I don't know how it breaks out as far as verses and material. But we covered this first general section, self and God, or general wisdom, if you want to call it that. This is a lot of things to apply to self. And there are others that will apply to self as well, speech and work and money dealings. But these didn't fit necessarily into those three larger categories. And of course, there'll be personal, or there'll be a section on relationships. And I don't know exactly yet what order for sure I'll go in with those sections, but those are the sections: self and God, or general wisdom, which is what we're on, relationships, money, work, and speech. But we began this first major section, kind of a general look at wisdom and knowledge. There's a lot of discussion of that in the book of Proverbs. We talked about this concept that a phrase or something similar that pops up a lot in Proverbs, fear of the Lord. We looked at this word abomination. It's used several times in the book of Proverbs as well. Talked about the concept of trusting in God, trust in the Lord. Gratitude is a very short section, but there is Proverbs does address gratitude. And then we got a little further than halfway. I forgot. We covered discretion, and the last section we covered, like May 28th, would have been fools and foolishness. We'll see what the book of Proverbs has to say about fools. So, that said, we'll jump in tonight looking at Proverbs, what it has to say about pride, or we might say arrogance. Also, sometimes it'll address it from the positive standpoint of humility, encouraging humility, discouraging pride and arrogance. But then we'll look at, I put these together because sometimes we even use the word temperance to talk about abstaining from alcohol. And so I put this section together because there's several verses in Proverbs that specifically deal with alcohol and encouraging the reader to be wise and stay away from that. And then but we'll put that together with just a general look at self-control or temperance, self-discipline, we might say. I don't know if we'll get into it tonight or not, but the next section will be leadership and authority. Just a lot of principles that Proverbs says toward those who are in leadership. Might even be, I ended up making a change on this one toward the end of last quarter. If I'm remembering correctly, I went back and got leadership section down to verses that address the leader. It may not necessarily be, if it's a verse that addresses, hey, if you are a subject of the king, for instance, if you're a citizen, here's wisdom for you. Cover those in a different section, if I remember correctly. I started to do that, and I waffled on it, and it's been a quarter since then, so I had to go back and look. But I'm pretty sure I did, looking at my notes here. So, like I said, I may end up going with a different one because leadership's a long section. I doubt there's a chance of getting pride, temperance, and leadership all in tonight. So we may, if we have time to start another section, I may jump to one of the other ones, but we'll see. We'll see how that goes. Let's talk about pride and see what the book of Proverbs has to say about pride. I will, I think I said this last couple of sessions of the previous quarter. I print these out just to make it quicker so we can cover a little bit more each class. I know I'll try to give you time to turn to them, but what I will do is when I start a new section, I'll make sure that you know about that. And then wherever I start, like chapter 6 is where we're going to start with our first verses on pride. Well, from there, we'll go forward in the book of Proverbs. These will all go in order. And so then when we start another subcategory, I'll give you the first chapter and we'll move. So it should be fairly easy to keep up, I think. If I go too fast, if I get to one you have a comment or you say, hey, hang on, I didn't get quite turned over there to read that, might have something, an observation to make or something, jump in. As I said previously, you're not going to hurt my feelings. I'm encouraging that because sometimes I'll just get to rolling, and if somebody doesn't, wave a hand or just say, "Hey, Brother Chad, I got a question, I got a comment," then I may not know. So let's talk about, if I can get this clicker right. Let's talk about pride. Proverbs has a lot to say about pride. Proverbs chapter 6, as I mentioned, is where we'll begin. 6, verses 16 and 17. Familiar verses to probably most, if not all of us. These 6 things doth the Lord hate. Yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. Now, of course, some of these we'll cover when we talk about speech and interpersonal relationships. But, in fact, 2 of these deal with speech, particularly false speech. But verse 17 says, a proud look, that's top of the list. A proud look, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood. So that's among the 7 things that God hates and he's not going to tolerate. And so we need to be aware of that. Warning against pride. Proverbs 8, verse 13. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogancy, and the evil way, and the froward mouth do I hate. This is in the midst of one of those sections. In fact, really the entirety of chapter 8 is wisdom is personified. It's as if wisdom is this lady, and we talked about that in our introduction. I won't go back over all that. But it's as if wisdom is this lady who is saying, listen to me. You listen to me, I will help you. I will instruct you. I will keep you in the way you should go. I will help you to have the best possible life. Well, in verse 13, she says, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Pride and arrogancy and the evil way and the froward mouth do I hate. Chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 2. When pride cometh, then cometh shame, but with the lowly is wisdom. So when pride comes, shame is soon to follow. That, again, not always the case. We discussed this at length in our introduction to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs are truisms. They're general truths, but there are exceptions because life is complicated. Humans have free will, and as the book of Ecclesiastes says in chapter 9, and we just started a study of the book of Ecclesiastes on Sunday morning. I was telling somebody, I didn't realize this until probably the week leading up to last Sunday. It just didn't even hit me, but somebody had asked me, it's been several weeks back, said, hey, what about a study of Ecclesiastes sometime? Well, we were within 4 or 5 weeks of finishing the quarter, so I said, you know what, I think I may teach that whenever we finish the Questions Jesus Asked series on Sunday morning. And so I decided to do that. Well, I'd already committed to it and started my preparation, and I realized, we're studying Proverbs on Wednesday night after the summer series. But that's okay. As I said to them, to the person I was speaking to earlier about that, there's just going to be a whole lot of wisdom dispensed on Sundays and Wednesdays, because Ecclesiastes has some proverbs in it, and it's all about Solomon trying to figure out what is life all about? What's the purpose? How do you have real joy and meaning in life? And so there's some interesting following Solomon's grand experiment. But anyway, that's as the wise man says in Ecclesiastes 9, time and chance happens to them all. And so there are a lot of complexities in life, and it doesn't always, these are not meant to be, 100% that's the way it's always going to be. But generally speaking, when pride comes, then comes shame. But with the lowly is wisdom. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, you're going to see a lot of Solomon's struggle to understand some of the exceptions to these truisms. Some of them are those that he wrote, and yet he'll sometimes even say things like, well, I looked at the world, and here's a wise man, here's a fool. Here's a rich man, here's a poor man. Here's a human, here's an animal. There's one event that happens to them all. What is that? Death. And so sometimes he struggles with things like that. But you get the idea here that these are truisms. When pride comes, then comes shame, but with the lowly is wisdom. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 10. Only by pride cometh contention, but with the well-advised is wisdom. Now, do you catch the contrast here? We sometimes talk about Hebrew parallelism, and I just went blank on there's a certain type of Hebrew parallelism where it's contrasting. Antithetical, that's it, thank you. Antithetical parallelism is where you have contrasting thoughts. So here's, on the one hand, pride. It's gonna bring contention. But on the other hand is well-advised, meaning somebody who listens to advice. Well, they listen to good advice, wise advice, because there are plenty of people out there that will give bad advice as well, right? But it's somebody who they don't have that prideful mentality of, well, I already got it figured out. I don't need your input. I don't need your advice. Maybe somebody says, hey, could I offer you a little bit of advice? Somebody may say, no, don't care, don't want to hear it. Or sometimes people may listen, quote, listen, but they have no intention of taking it to heart. They have no intention of giving it a fair hearing. Just sort of whatever, say what you want, free country, and then they just dismiss it and go along. But you see the contrasting idea. By pride comes contention, but with the well-advised, somebody who's willing to listen, there's wisdom. There's wisdom in that, and being willing to consider and to take advice. Next one is in Proverbs 15. Proverbs 15, verse 25. It says there, the Lord will destroy the house of the proud, but he will establish the border of the widow. So particularly that first phrase, the Lord will destroy the house of the proud. Again, that proud look's one of those things, one of those 7 things that are an abomination to God. Proverbs 15, same chapter here, verse 33. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. So here's one of those where it approaches it from a positive standpoint, encouraging us to have this. So the fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, before honor is humility. Chapter 16, verse 5. Everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Notice this next phrase, though hand join in hand, he shall not be unpunished. So the proud in heart are an abomination to the Lord, and you may look around and the whole earth is just filled, chock full of pride and arrogance. God says it's not going to change the having to be held accountable, to answer, to be judged for our attitudes and our hearts. 16:18 might be one of the better known verses in all of the book of Proverbs. Dare say most, if not all of us, could quote it. Pride goes before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall. We sometimes, I guess the more common way of, and it's basically saying the same thing, but it took me a little bit because I'd hear it all the time as a child. And when I remember going to preaching school, and first time at least I can remember, I ran across this verse, and I was like, wait a minute, is that right? Because what do we usually say? How do we sort of paraphrase it? Pride goes before a fall. And so it says pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. But again, the paraphrase, it's not like it's doing damage to the verse, it's just not quite. And I just remember reading that a couple of different times. I was like, wait a minute, have I always heard that wrong? But we sort of say it, at least that's the way I heard it growing up, was pride goes before a fall. But again, one of those well-known verses in Proverbs, a warning. Pride goes before destruction. Haughty spirit is just another way of saying arrogance or pride. This would be, maybe you can help me out again, Bob. I'm forgetting all the different kinds of parallelism. Is it synthetical, something like that? Parallelism, when it says the same thing but in slightly different words. And that's what you have in 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Basically saying the same thing, just slightly different wording. Proverbs 17, verse 19. He loves, or loveth, the King James says, transgression, that loveth strife, and he that exalteth his gate seeketh destruction. The idea there of exalting the gate is kind of pride. Adam Clark has some lengthy comments about that, or not. I don't know if I'd say lengthy, but he has several things to say about that. But that's kind of the idea. It might be taking pride in your defenses. Remember, in the Old Testament, God says that, get the right book here, it's Obadiah. It's a prophecy against what people? Edom. And one of the strong rebukes that God has for them is their pride. And part of their pride was they were situated in such a place that it was at least seemingly impregnable. It would be very difficult to conquer them. And listen, they were in a very good spot as far as that goes. It was not an easy location to get to them and to conquer and invade that city and that people. However, God says, I can bring you down, and I will bring you down. Your arrogance is part of why you're going to be punished and suffer and be judged. So the idea there, that's kind of behind that, he that exalteth his gate seeketh destruction. Proverbs 18 verse 12. Before destruction, the heart of man is haughty, and before honor is humility. Well, humility leads to honor. A haughty spirit or a proud, arrogant spirit leads to destruction. Just as simple as that, as a wise man says it. Chapter 20, verse 29. The glory of young men is their strength, and the beauty of old men is the gray head. I sort of debated on this one because I don't know if it's necessarily addressing pride here. It's kind of a contrast between young men, older men, and you know how that is, especially, well, as you get older, we know how that is because perhaps in youth, not so much. But the pride of youths is the strength. I can do that. I can fix that. I don't need help with that. But he says the glory of old men is the gray head, meaning what? Well, it might mean learning to work a little smarter, might be having to learn to work around some difficulties that perhaps were not there in youth. It might be relying more on wisdom than just brute strength. So there's a contrast there. And again, it's not like it's saying that, all young men are proud because of that strength, but it's a contrast. Sometimes the young man or even young lady, they might get prideful because of that youthful strength and exuberance, but sometimes that gets tempered in older age, and so there's a definite contrast there. So I debated on that one, but I went ahead and put it in there because I think there is a sort of an illusion there, because it could be that someone gets prideful because of that. Proverbs 21, chapter 21, verse 2. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord pondereth the hearts. Again, pride not explicitly mentioned here, but it's that idea of a man's ways being right in his own eyes. Well, he just thinking, I got this figured out. Whether he necessarily does or not, that's the mentality. And that, again, I don't know that it has to be prideful in that sense, but it could easily become that way. Chapter 21, verse 4, just a couple of verses later. And high look and a proud heart, and the plowing of the wicked is sin. Same chapter, drop down to verse 24. 21:24. Proud and haughty scorner is his name, who dealeth in proud wrath. Here's somebody who's not only prideful, but they're wrathful, an easily angered type person. That's not a fun person to be around. If you've ever been around somebody like that, it's not easy to deal with. A person who not only is proud, but they're filled with wrath. Chapter 26, verse 12. Seest thou a man wise in his own conceit? There's more hope of a fool than of him. And we ended last quarter, and I know that's been at least, 13, 14 weeks ago. But most people are familiar with a lot of what Proverbs has to say about fools. It's not a pretty picture that Proverbs paints of a fool. We might even say, when you read the book of Proverbs, you are almost tempted to pity the fool. Nothing. All right. That was my joke. That's all I got. Pity the fool? I pity the fool. So, it doesn't paint a very good picture of fools, right, in the book of Proverbs. And yet, notice what this verse says, 26:12. Seest thou a man wise in his own conceit? There's more hope for a fool than that person. The person who is wise in his own eyes, again, it's that know-it-all mentality that comes from pride. It's that nobody can teach me anything mentality that comes from pride. I don't need anybody's help with anything mentality that comes from pride. And most people would not, well, a lot of people would not come out and say that. I don't need anybody's advice. I don't need anybody's help. But do we not sometimes behave that way and betray that mentality through our behavior? And it may not even be that I think nobody can teach me anything. But having that mentality of It might even be in a particular area. I don't need anybody's help in that. And it's not based on necessarily, we're not talking about a situation, because we understand sometimes a person may be an expert in something, a particular field, a particular study, and here comes somebody that they're by no means an expert. They're a novice. And again, a lot of times it's because of pride. They think they can instruct you. You are that expert. You are that person who knows so much about that field or that study. And so here comes somebody and they think, they're going to instruct you, tell you how this ought to be. I've mentioned before that I did, I almost hesitate to say I worked in it. I was looking for a preaching job at the time, and I sometimes joke with people, there's kind of some truth in it though, that here we were, Reagan was pregnant with Joshua, and I was going to a bunch of different congregations. I'm trying out here, I'm trying out there. Everybody wanted a 35-year-old preacher with 30 years preaching experience and 4 or 5 children. And so it was just like, we were having a time, and it took 2 or 3 months before we ended up settling in Chattanooga. But at one point, I just needed some money. We were starting to dive into our emergency funds, and so I needed some money. Well, there was a member of the church there that he was not in on some of the mistreatment that we had received, and he just told me he was a heating and air guy. He ran a heating and air business, install them, service them. He said, "Look, I run my own business, but I could use some help, and I could pay." I think he said he would pay me like $50 a day. He said, "I know that's not much." I said, "Well, hey, that's something. I'll take it." But I said, "Here's the thing, Billy. I don't know beans about heating and air." He said, "Do you know how to hold a flashlight?" Yeah, I said, "Yeah, I can do that. Even I can do that." He said, "Do you know the difference in a Phillips head and a straight head screwdriver?" "I do know that." He said, "Then I can use you." He said, "Well, he did have one more question." He said, "Are you willing to go up in an attic?" Sure. Now that, I had no idea what I was agreeing to. In South Alabama in July, I had no clue. But I said, sure. And so I went and I worked with him. But Billy, one of the things that he would get so frustrated about as we would ride around going on service calls and such, and he'd talk some of the code. You have to do everything according to the code, But he said some of the things that frustrated him most about that was code being written by people sitting in an office, that they're not out there in the field. They're not working. They're not doing this work and on site. And he said, yet they hand down all these, many times just arbitrary rules and regulations and try to tell the ones who are actually doing it on the front line, so to speak, how it ought to be. And if you don't do that, you're going to be in so much trouble and you're going to have to pay fines and all this stuff. And he said, it's just maddening. And sometimes you run into that. But that's kind of this idea, a man wise in his own conceit. I'm not saying, I don't know about, if your uncle's cousin or nephew or whatever is somebody that's working in writing code for something. I'm not trying to say they're proud and haughty or whatever. I don't know that everybody's like that in that business, but you know what I'm talking about. You get the idea. Chapter 28, verse 25. Y'all are a really tough crowd tonight. Chapter 28, verse 25. He that is of a proud heart stirreth up strife, but he that putteth his trust in the Lord shall be made fat. Now, that's the way the King James puts it. The ESV has that last phrase, he that putteth his trust in the Lord shall be enriched. And that's the idea, as we would say it. Prospered, yeah. New King James. And that's a good way of putting it. It's that idea of prospering, being blessed, but of he that is of a proud heart, he's stirring up strife. And by the way, notice the proud in heart is contrasted to the one who trusts in the Lord. And then notice, finally, last verse for this subsection, chapter 29, verse 23. A man's pride shall bring him low, but honor shall uphold the humble in spirit. Again, contrasting thoughts. Pride brings the man low. Honor upholds the humble in spirit. It kind of reminds us of a verse we read in the New Testament. Anybody know where I'm going with that? We sometimes sing it. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. James 4:10. Somebody check me out on that. It is 10. Thank you. So, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, he will lift you up. And that's a biblical principle. It goes all the way back to the Old Testament, but we're taught that in the New Testament as well. That's a universal spiritual principle. Anything else on pride? There's a lot more we could say. We kind of stuck to verses from Proverbs, just a couple outside references here and there, but the Bible, and this is one of the reasons I stayed in Proverbs for this little subsection, because we could spend weeks talking about pride. The Bible has so much to say about that. It is, as the slide says there, pride the destroyer. It will destroy us. Yes, sir.
So when I was more active doing apologetics in the area of evolution and creation, I came across several opponents of creation. And some of the attitudes they had was, you're the fool. I mean, I really know science. Another one was, if they couldn't quiet me or push me away, just intimidate. They just intimidate. And then if they are over you in educational level, they could make life difficult for you. But the Christian who's not studying and not, digging deep, they could be affected by those types of attitudes. And I think sometimes in the church we developed an anti-intellectual culture where we're not really interested in, graduate level training and so forth. But remember, Brother Thomas Warren said the real battle is in the thinking about the culture and what the values are. And that's where the real battle is. And that's what Christian evidence is attempting to do. And we hope Brother Lyons helps us in that area.
And when people get that kind of arrogance, it's hard to reason with them regardless. But I've seen that, what you're talking about, with some of, I've seen it in Christians as well, to be fair. I'm not saying that's just a skeptic, agnostic, atheist problem. I've seen it, sadly, among even members of the body of Christ. But sometimes people can be it's the old adage, their mind's made up, don't bother them with the facts. And I can't remember who told this, who it happened to. I heard it from, I think, an instructor in preaching school. But it was years ago, there was a brother he was teaching in, it was one of the brotherhood schools. I think it was a graduate school. But he was teaching some things that were very much not biblically sound. And there was a student in the class who pushed back a little bit and said, well, now, the Bible says, and mentioned what the Bible said on that particular subject or whatever. And this guy, this was supposedly a gospel preacher, supposedly a Christian. And his response was, when it went back and forth a little bit, and I don't know if he just kind of realized he couldn't answer the argument or what, he couldn't deal with what the scripture said, but he finally sort of stopped and he said, son, do you have a master's degree? Well, no, sir, I'm here in college to get my master's degree. Oh, that's right, you just have a bachelor's degree. Do you have a PhD? Do you have your doctorate? Well, no, sir. He said, well, why don't you come back and talk to me when you do? And that was kind of his, to paraphrase it, that was his response. And That's that intimidation.
You know, he may have been taught that way himself. Now, the reason why I bring that up, I've tried to push back, and I've tried to study, and I busted through that wall a few times. It's worth the effort.
It is.
Work through that, and you realize these folks don't have that much power over you if you could kind of get in their head, figure out the argument, and realize God's point of view, the biblical point of view, is the one that makes the most sense, and their view is somewhat foolish.
Right. And it's difficult. And that kind of brings us segues nicely right into our section on self-control. Because sometimes when you're dealing with somebody, especially if it's a prideful person and they want to be combative and intimidating towards you, it's very easy to lose control, to lose that self-control and get angry. And sometimes, again, to mention a situation, there was a debate that some gospel preacher had with another fellow when I was in preaching school. It was down in Mississippi somewhere. But the debate happened when I was, I think, maybe in my first year. And I just remember one of my instructors coming in. He actually had attended the debate that night previously. And it was a graduate of the school that was defending the truth. And he just kind of laid it out for us. He was nice about it, but he was plain. He said, Brother so-and-so he had his arguments in order. He was very well prepared. But he was so angry, or at least came across that way the entire time, that I fear, if anything, he completely lost the audience. And so, yeah, it's kind of it does segue nicely into talking about temperance and self-control. First verse for this is in Proverbs 19. And again, we'll move forward from there. Proverbs 19, verse 19. Notice what it says here, dealing with this concept of self-control or temperance. A man of great wrath shall suffer punishment, for if thou deliver him, yet thou must do it again. Some of these we've talked about in our series that I finished up not terribly long ago, looking at the reasons why we struggle in relationships, sometimes the reasons why people don't like us. Well, a man of great wrath, he's gonna suffer punishment. If you deliver him, you'll have to do it again and again and again. In other words, you got no self-control. You're going to have to deliver. If you do it, you'll find yourself having to help that person over and over and over again. And at some point, you just become an enabler. Proverbs 20, verse 27. The spirit of man is the candle of the Lord, searching all the inward parts of the belly. The idea there, God's knowing us inside and out and us having control over our own spirit. Now move on to 21:17. He that loveth pleasure shall be a poor man. He that loveth wine and oil shall not be rich. Hey, if you all you ever want to do is have fun, you don't understand that there's a time to have fun. Yes, there's time for recreation, but there's a time for work to get serious. So you just love pleasure all the time, nonstop, you're gonna be a poor man. If you love wine and oil, something that'll eat. You got expensive tastes, in other words, he says, that'll eat up your pocketbook as well. 21:29. A wicked man hardeneth his face, but as for the upright, he directeth his way. Adam Clark, commenting on this, said that he mentions about 50 or so different manuscripts or ancient editions with some of the versions that read, he understands. In other words, a wicked man hardens his face, but as for the upright, he understands his way. And that's that idea of self-control. He understands his way. He's able to direct himself in walking in the way that is right. 22:5. 22:5. Thorns and snares are in the way of the froward. He that doth keep his soul shall be far from them. Keeps his soul. Controls himself. Disciplined. 22:8. He that soweth iniquity shall reap vanity, and the rod of his anger shall fail. 23, 1 through 3. When thou sittest to eat with a ruler, consider diligently what is before thee, and put a knife to thy throat if thou be a man given to appetite. This is what we might call hyperbole, exaggeration for the sake of emphasis. Hey, if you're a person that's given to appetite, extravagance, put a knife to your throat. Be not desirous of his dainties, for they are deceitful meat. He goes on to say in verse 3. Same chapter 23, verses 6 through 8. Eat thou not the bread of him that hath an evil eye, neither desire thou his dainty meats. For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, saith he to thee, but his heart is not with thee. The morsel which thou hast eaten shalt thou vomit up and lose thy sweet words. 23, same chapter here, again down towards the latter part of the chapter, 19 through 21. Hear thou, my son, and be wise, and guide thine heart in the way. Be not among winebibbers, among riotous eaters of flesh, for the drunkard and the glutton shall come to poverty, and drowsiness shall clothe a man with rags. All that just saying, here's a person that gets himself into trouble because he doesn't have any self-control. He's sitting at the table, and here's a guy that he's playing you. But because you don't have that discipline, that self-control, that temperance, and just eating it up, and you end up getting yourself many times like that into a situation. How many times have people gotten themselves into trouble because a lack of self-control in financial matters? Maybe somebody comes along with some kind of scheme, and they draw people in many times, and sometimes people are just slick enough that they can get even, honest, hard-working people or whatever. That certainly happens. But by far, at least the easiest targets, and probably more often than not, we find out that the ones that fall into stuff like that, there's a lack of that temperance. And it's not to say there's just no self-control whatsoever, but I know I've been there. I had a situation one time when in my college days that it was going to make you a lot of money, and I got burned. And I'm thankful I didn't get burned for more. It could have been a lot worse. But I can look back on it now and see it was my own lack of self-control that just blinded me. And probably a healthy dose of just greed and covetousness mixed in with that got me into trouble. 24:10. If thou faint in the day of adversity, thy strength is small. In other words, having strength to endure. That's that idea of temperance, self-control, self-discipline. Strength to endure even in the day of adversity. 25:16 and 17. Hast thou found honey? Eat so much as is sufficient for thee, lest thou be filled therewith and vomit it. Too much of a good thing, we would say, right? Withdraw thy foot, verse 17 says, from thy neighbor's house, lest he be weary of thee and so hate thee. Brother Cates, I can just hear him and see him reading this verse, and he'd always, when he wanted to make a point, sometimes he'd sort of cock his head to the side and he'd say, don't wear out your welcome. That's what he's saying in verse 17. But it's having the temperance, self-control, self-awareness, to have sense, to realize, like, hey, I can wear out my welcome even at a neighbor's house, at a friend's house. Same thing with this honey. Is honey a bad thing? No. He says you eat so much of it, you'll puke. He says have some self-control. 25, 21, and 22. If thine enemy be hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he be thirsty, give him water to drink. For thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head, and the Lord shall reward thee. This goes back to what we were talking about with Bob just a moment ago. Sometimes people can mistreat us, talk ugly to us, talk down to us. Self-control means I don't have to give that back. 25, 27, and 27, 28. It's not good to eat much honey, for men to search their own glory is not good. And here's the verse that's on the screen there. He that hath no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down and without walls. Man, what a powerful verse that is. What a powerful illustration. 27, 7, and 8. The full soul loatheth an honeycomb, but to the hungry soul every bitter thing is sweet. As a bird that wandereth from her nest, so is a man that wandereth from his place. And then last 20 and 21 of that same chapter, chapter 27, verses 20 and 21, hell and destruction are never full. Literally Sheol, the Hadean realm, or sometimes means the grave. And destruction are never full. So the eyes of man are never satisfied. As the finding pot for silver and the furnace for gold, so is a man to his praise. You want to see how much self-control a guy's got? Give him some praise. And you'll see how much humility, how much self-control he's got. All right, so we're out of time. We'll pick up next week talking about the verses. It's still kind of in that temperance section, but the verses relative to alcohol. We got through the ones that strictly deal with self-control. We'll look at that verses on alcohol and then move forward from there. Thank y'all very much. Appreciate your time and the comments as well.